Well, good evening. It's good to see each of you. We're continuing our study through the book of Revelation, and we are in lesson 5. This is actually class number 6, so we're running just a little bit behind. And just by way of a reminder, Revelation is a very figurative, a very symbolic book. And we've seen that already as we've gone through the first 3 chapters, but it's going to become even more so as we go through the remainder of the book. So we leave behind the section that is the most like an epistle, where it's addressed directly to people. And we're going into the section that is the visions that he is providing for us. So this is going to be even, in some ways, a big difference, but in some ways not, because it is some similarity to what we've been doing. So, in one of the things I want to mention as introduction, just as we go into this, when I was a kid, they had these decoder rings that you would get every now and then in a box of cereal. You line the circles up just right. And some number 1 was A and 2 was B. You get the idea, right? And the idea is that each symbol, each number or letter corresponded with a single letter. And it was a 1-for-1. If you saw this, you swapped it out for this. What you're going to see as we go through these symbols is they're more like our words. Our words often have multiple meanings, and you have to consider the context and figure out which one of the meanings is intended by the author just by looking at the context, just like we do with our words. So if you have that same kind of imagination of how these symbols work like I did when I was a kid and was first learning how to do this, it doesn't work like that. So that makes our job a little bit trickier because we have to consider the context as we look at the meaning of each one of these symbols. So just keep that in mind as we go. All right, so opening up chapter 4, as this vision opens, where is John transported?
He is transported to heaven.
All right, he goes to heaven. What is the time frame of the fulfillment? All right, so things that must take place after this. All right, so what do we learn from those implications? Or what are the implications we take from those statements? What inferences can we draw?
It's not supposed to be in the future.
All right, good. So this is something that has a specific fulfillment, and it's something that's nearby. So that's going to eliminate our idealist position, which says there's never a specific application because it kind of always generally applies. And it's also going to eliminate the futurist position, who's always pushing this out to the end of the world, the whole thing, pushing it out to the end of the world, making the application in the distant future. All right, so chapter 4, 1 through 2, after these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me. So the idea of great power associated with the voice, saying, "Come up here, and I will show you the things which must take place after this." Immediately, I was in the Spirit. All right, so this is a phrase that we've seen earlier. In the Spirit has to do with being under the control or under the direction, the inspiration, the guidance of the Spirit. And it's almost always, as far as I know, every time, it has to do with either prophecy or something that's symbolic. And then the first thing he sees is this throne set in heaven and one set upon the throne. All right, so as we said, notice he's coming up here in heaven. This is different than what we saw in the first chapter. Remember, John was on the island of Patmos, and he says he was in the Spirit, but then he heard a voice behind him. There's no indication that he really changed place. He changed location. He still had a very earthly perspective. Jesus, if you will, condescended to him and appeared to him in symbolic form, gave him instructions and the letters to write, but John didn't go anywhere. In this case, John is going up to heaven. And so his perspective is going to be from that of heaven, how things would appear up in heaven. All right, so this is, as Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians, this is what we think of as the third heaven. The first 3 heavens, the first one just being the sky, our atmosphere, the second one being the stars, the universe beyond our atmosphere, and the third heaven being where God dwells. So this is the same reference that Paul has in 2 Corinthians 12. All right, so we talked about the after this. This is something that is immediately applicable. It's not distant future. And so this eliminates the futurist and the idealist. It also eliminates the late preterist who says it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and he's writing about it after the fact. Because that's looking back, this is looking forward. So it also eliminates that perspective as well. All right, and as I said, the idea of the fact that he's in the Spirit in heaven, this is also going to suggest that this is a very figurative. Obviously, this is not literal what he's describing to us. So it again eliminates the futurist position who's taking all this literally. So we've looked at these points before, but we're continuing to see this if we're paying attention to it as we go through the verses. All right, easy question. Who is represented by the one on the throne? But then how is he described? That's the harder part. What do these things represent about him? So, easy one. Who's on the throne? God. All right, we have God the Father on the throne. How is he described here?
He's described like precious gemstones, and there's a rainbow around his throne.
All right, very good. So, we're not told anything about like his face, his clothes, or anything. There is a lot that is not told about him. That's not told to us. So that is an obvious omission. That's not something that is important for us to know the exact features there. But what we see instead is what he consists of. And it appears that he is made out of the most precious gems. So behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne, and he who sat on there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald. So it's hard for me to imagine a rainbow made out of one color. So I'm assuming that the colors are kind of all variations of like a dark green, right? From like a lighter green to a dark green. But I don't know. You have the same words that I have, right? And that's just kind of the way I'm imagining this. So what we have is the king of all existence. This is God the Father, who's at the center of everything. Jasper stone, this would have been a very precious gemstone. Today, when it's dug up, it is red. It was probably actually green back in their time due to the change of minerals where this is actually dug out. But regardless, it's described as being clear as crystal, which is not like that stone back then or now. This is a different kind of this. This is not unusual for Revelation. We're going to see at the end, when heaven is described as a street, having a street of gold, it's also going to be described as being clear as crystal. I've never seen gold that's transparent, but that's how this is described. So I'm assuming this is something that is luminescence, where it's both very bright and shiny, but yet he's able to see through it as well. The sardius stone is a reddish stone that's also very precious and valuable as well. So, what does this mean? There's a couple of ways to think about this. Remember the high priest had the breastplate with the 12 gemstones? This was the first and the last stone. So, this could be a summation of saying, okay, all of the things that are valuable are contained within God. Everything that is precious, everything that's desirable, everything that's beautiful, he consists of that. That's what he is made up out of. Ezekiel 28:13 also talks about a list of precious stones. And again, this is the first, and depending on how you read it and translate it, it could be the last or one of the later ones. But again, one of the ideas that this is kind of like the bookends of the valuable gemstones. So, God's value, his preciousness, his beauty being identified by that. One other thought is, if you try to say, again, going back to our decoder ring, if you say, well, this gem represents this characteristic and this one represents that one, then maybe you can break it down. So several Psalms talk about righteousness and justice proceeding from God's throne. So maybe righteousness is the white stone for purity, and justice is the red stone for judgment, for maybe some kind of wrath. We are going to read about fire proceeding from the throne later. So that could be the idea. Mercy, truth, and loving kindness is something that every good king's throne is established upon. And then Psalm 103:19 says that God's throne is high above everything else. So again, going back to the idea of supremacy, but also value above everything else. So that's another possibility. So just a thought on the rainbow real quick. There's not a lot of association that's tied to this, just a few ways this is used. You can think about from our own experience. When do you see the rainbow? After the storm passes. So the idea being that you're far removed from the storm. This is something that is a tranquil scene. It's a beautiful scene. And in fact, it's used later in the book in chapter 10:1 of a mighty angel. That is for sure not Jesus or God, because this person is going to swear by God. So it's not him, and he is described as having a rainbow around his head. So this could just be something to, again, enhance the idea of glory and beauty and power. In Ezekiel 1:28, in a very similar scene to Revelation 4, God is described as having this brightness around him that's like a rainbow. So there is a reference in a very similar image or symbol that could be suggesting his, again, brightness, his glory, his beauty, etc. The only other thing that may come to mind is the promise made to Noah, right? And he says specifically, when I see that, I will remember my promise and I will keep it. I will not destroy the world with water again. So this could be an allusion back to God keeps his promises, going all the way back, even to the earliest promises. He still hasn't forgotten, and he's going to keep his promises no matter what. So any of those ideas, maybe all of those ideas, it's hard to say for example, or for sure, for certainty, but these symbols do make us think of those things. Specifically, it's hard to say which, if any, are preferred over the others. All right, any questions about this and this vision here of God on the throne?
Do you think that the clear as crystal, when he's talking about the gold, is maybe not necessarily talking about the translucent factor of the gold, but the reflection of the gold? They would not have had access to extremely clear mirrors then,
Right.
like we would today. And so maybe that's what it's talking about, because when you get really flat, really pure gold, it doesn't have any imperfections to distort the light, so what you left is a clear.
It could be just a reference to the fact that it is extremely bright, the ultimate in brightness and reflectivity. So that could be the idea. And that's certainly valid, right? The idea that it's very glorious, right? Very precious, very unusual, very valuable. All right, good thoughts. All right, so the next thing is we continue kind of looking at this, and if you notice, this all of chapter 4 is almost like just a single picture. And we're getting pieces of it described to us little by little. There are parts that are in motion, there are things that are being said, but we're having more of a breakdown of a single picture as opposed to like a movie scene that's set before us. But in some ways it is a lot like a scene of a play or something that's set up. All right, around the throne were 24 thrones. And on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their head. So who do you think these 24 elders are? Who do they represent?
Did they represent the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles?
I think that's the best guess. And that's the thing, that 12 is actually outside of the children of Israel and the 12 tribes. I don't know where else it's used. It is used very rarely, almost exclusively, of the 12 tribes of Israel. Just taking a step back, looking at elders. So they're always associated with the leadership of the people, often spiritual. Think like elders of the church. But cities had elders, tribes had elders, and in the collection of the elders of the tribes, you would have the elders of Israel, who often met and convened as well. So Exodus 12:21, the instruction for the Passover feast was delivered to the elders, even as early as that time. Numbers 11:16 through 17 talks about the 70 elders who met with God and met with Moses and ate before God as a ratification of the covenant. Actually, that's going to be in Exodus. Numbers 11, the 70 elders there is a different time when we have the 70 elders. I believe that may be when Moses' father-in-law suggested that he set up the 70 elders to judge over Israel. But we have references several places throughout both the Old and the New Testament to elders being used. So as we think about the 2 by 12, they're often, again, used with wisdom, judgment, discernment. This is probably not leaders of Jew and Gentile, because by this time we know from Galatians 3:28 and Ephesians 2:11 through 15, he's destroyed that middle wall of partition. There's one man, not Jew and Gentile. There's one person now, one body. So maybe this is all the saints living and all the saints that are dead, those that are in heaven, those that are in earth. It's all of God's people in kind of two different places, if you will. I think probably the best, though, is what Jesse said. Again, the 12 tribes is the fundamental basis of that symbol of representing all of God's people. And then in Matthew 19:28, Jesus tells the 12 apostles that they will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So he specifically makes the connection in a spiritual symbol to the apostles, again, being on thrones and actually judging all of God's people, spiritual Israel, if you will. So I think that's probably the best explanation. So again, they represent all of God's people before the cross, after the cross. I don't know that they represent specific people. Like, I don't think John looked up there and goes, "Ooh, look, there's me." I doubt that happened. So I think this is representative of these apostles, the greatest authorities, if you will, of the new covenant versus the greatest authorities and leaders of the old covenant. So if you will, this is kind of, if you think about this, everything we're looking at is the pinnacle. This is the pinnacle of human leadership, authority, and wisdom that's being pictured here before us. Not specific people as much as what they represent. All right. And certainly God is depicted in this kind of way as well. So what do you think is the significance of their crowns and robes? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, white's often a symbol of purity,
Mm-hmm.
and the crowns could be crowns of life.
All right, good. So around the throne, 24 thrones, 24 elders, white robes, crowns of gold on their head. So one thing that's interesting, there's actually two different words for crown throughout the New Testament, at least two. There may be others. But you're going to see primarily in Revelation as well as other books. So the first one is Stephanos. I'm having a hard time not saying it with a Germanic accent. But it means victory. In fact, when you see somebody named Stephen, that's where their name is coming from. It's from this word, and the idea is associated with victory. And so this is the crown of victory. So think like the Olympics, right? The garland thing that's set on their head. That's the idea. They've won some prize. They've had some great accomplishment. Maybe they've won a battle. But the idea is victory as a general rule. Matthew 27:29, that's actually an ironic exception. The crown of thorns that's pressed into Jesus' head is Stephanos. But other places throughout scriptures, and again, I'm leaving this for you to look at later, but Paul's going to talk about brethren being his crown, his joy. We're admonished not to lose our crown and to hold on to it. So this idea of being something associated with our victory is prominent throughout scriptures. We're also going to see this in Revelation by not only the elders, but also the rider on the white horse. We're going to see in chapter 6 at the beginning, the army of locusts in chapter 9, and the glorious woman of chapter 12. And then one like the Son of Man in 14. So by contrast, you'll actually kind of recognize our English word, diadem. So a diadema would be a crown worn by royalty. So this is not a crown so much of victory, but this is a crown of authority, of position. This is what a king or queen or a prince would wear. So we're going to see it worn by Christ as well as the dragon in chapter 12 and by his sea beast in 13. So the key to note here is these 24 elders, they're not wearing a diadem. They're wearing the crown of victory. So there is a distinction to be made there. And then as Caleb pointed out, white robes, the idea of white always being associated with holiness, purity. Remember what God said through Isaiah, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. So the idea of whiteness. And then in Mark 9:3, Christ is described at the transfiguration also being clothed in white as bright as snow. So we have that idea here as well. All right. Any questions about this before we leave the elders and their crowns and their robes? Thoughts, comments? All right. So the next thing we see is seven burning lamps of fire before the throne. What do you think, or who, or what is represented by this? And why is it telling it to you this way? What's the symbol represent?
Calls them the seven spirits of God.
Mm-hmm.
Does that have to be the seven churches? Or?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So, I'll take one more.
I also kind of think about the seven lampstands from the temple.
Okay, there's a good representation there. All right, that's good. For sake of time, let's go ahead and look at it. So, and from the throne proceeding lightnings, thunderings, and voices, 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Just very quickly, the idea of the lightnings, thunderings, and voices. God is active here. This is the opposite of what we see at the contest with Baal, where they're calling, nothing's happening, and then finally Elijah speaks to God, and boom, lightning and fire falls. God is active, he's listening. That's the same idea here. It also makes us think of Mount Sinai. Remember when God first came down on Mount Sinai there. So he's not idle, he's not just sitting there. There's very powerful activity, communication that's emanating from there. So the 7 spirits of God, I think, is a reference to the Holy Spirit himself. Now it's odd. Why is this one spirit being described as 7 spirits? But again, we've got some precedents for this already. So, first of all, what do I think it's communicating? So, Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12. Psalm 139 is the omni-psalm about God. He's omniscient, he's omnipresent, he's omnipotent. So, Psalm 139 stands out, especially emphasizing God's omniscience and his omnipresence. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall follow me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. So, the idea of these lampstands, this is God's light. He's penetrating the darkness. He's seeing everything. He knows everything. He's everywhere. There's nowhere you can go that you're out of touch with God, and that he doesn't see you and he's lost track of you. All right, Zechariah 4, 2-10, I think is the basis of this symbol. And this is the reason why I'm okay with saying these 7 actually represent a single being. So in Zechariah's image, the angel speaks to him and says, what do you see? He says, I'm looking, there's a lampstand of solid gold with a bowl on top of it, and on the stand 7 lamps with 7 pipes to the 7 lamps. And he asks what they are, and the explanation is this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. All right, so this was the guy that was the governor at that time who was responsible for rebuilding the temple. Not by my might, nor by power, but by my spirit. So when he sees these 7 lampstands, he's supposed to think the Spirit of God is behind this. By my spirit, says the Lord of hosts, for who has despised the day of small things? For these 7 rejoice to see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. They are the eyes of the Lord, which scan to and fro throughout the whole earth. So, again, very closely tied to the idea of these 7 lamps that we're going to later see are covered in eyes as well, that see everything, and they have this penetrating light. So, also, as Caleb mentioned, there was a lampstand with 7 lamps in the tabernacle, and that was specifically designed to shine light in the holy place and shine it out. Be outward facing. It wasn't illuminating the most holy place. It was coming from the most holy place, illuminating, going out. And Caleb raised this point at home when we were talking about this. Hebrews 9:23 talks about the copies of the things in heaven being purified. The idea that heaven is the tabernacle and the temple is actually a representation of those things. So it kind of makes you wonder, all right, so then the 7 golden lampstands, were they supposed to be thinking that this was a representation of God's Spirit and him seeing them and them being always in his presence, him being aware of them? But anyway, so something else to think about, but I think the Zechariah passage makes the clearest connection to these 7 spirits actually being the Holy Spirit, him being described as 7 because we have the symbolic number. This is the complete max of God, if you will. This is the numbering of God. So oftentimes when we see 7, we should think like divine power, the completeness of God, or we should think that God has numbered something and cut it off. He said it comes this far and no further. So one of those 2 expressions. So questions, thoughts?
Jesus used, they approached Jesus when he's in Matthew 18, referring to like forgiving a brother, and they used the number 7.
Yeah.
777. So
Yep.
very interesting how they use that 7.
Yep. Yep. So what do you say? 7 times 70 or 70 times 7?
77, I think.
All right. So 7 times 7. Very good. Any other thoughts? All right. So let's go on and look at the other who are described as being before the throne. So we're told before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and back. All right, so let's talk about the sea of glass first. So what do you think is the significance of the sea before the throne? And there are multiple references to it throughout Revelation as well as the Bible.
I'm not sure, I kind of thought maybe it's a divider, or where other things are going on before God, like in the presence of God that he sees.
All right. So you're saying it's a divider to keep those things away, but he still sees them?
I'm not honestly, maybe it was a divider, or it was like something where everything else was going on.
Okay.
See?
So one or the other. Either it serves as a barrier or it's like a container where everything else is happening, kind of removed from him, but he's observing it. I think that's good. This one's a hard one for me. It's hard for me to nail it down specifically. I think sometimes it is actually used in Revelation to refer to literally the ocean. It is interesting, there was a bronze laver or a sea of bronze. Again, going back to this theme about the tabernacle and the temple being a shadow, a copy of the heavenly things. It was there, but I can't make a really strong connection to this because its primary purpose was it was a place for the priests to be cleansed lest they die. Before, like while they were touching the blood and the bloody animals, this was specifically for the priest, for cleaning the priest, and for them to continue their services outside of that. I have a hard time making a connection to that, especially given the other references that we're going to see. But I will mention that's there. So if we look at this symbolically, how it's used like in Revelation or in other places throughout the scripture, it's very prevalent that it's used in the other apocalyptic books like Daniel, Isaiah, as well as Jeremiah, to refer to basically society. This is the pool, this is the container for all the world, and it's not just referencing all the people, but it seems to reference the idea of like nations and governments, kingdoms rising and falling, people raging and roaring like the waves. That's the comparison that's often made. So the idea that a kingdom may raise and rise up out of the sea, that's used in Daniel 7 as well as in Revelation 13. But it's often tied to the roaring and the churning of the nations. And whenever something falls back into the sea, or maybe the water's pulled away from it, the rivers that are going into it are cut off, then that represents the destruction of that nation, its loss of people. So that there's a very strong connection there in a lot of places. But he also describes it being like glass, like crystal. So there's 2 ways to think about that. Is he emphasizing the fact that it's like made out of glass and that he can see through it? It's clear, it's transparent. If so, you can make a really good case for saying that God sees everything that happens in the kingdoms of men and nothing escapes him. That's the point that Daniel makes and impresses upon Nebuchadnezzar, which he doesn't believe until he spends some time as a beast himself. Or it could be the idea that it's it's tranquil. The idea of crystal, you think about it being solid, not moving, almost frozen. So this could be the idea that all of these things are happening, kind of as Caleb said, far removed, and God sees it, He knows it, but it's not affecting Him. The waves, the sea may be raging, but heaven is tranquil. It is a peaceful place. So you could think about all the verses that talk about God wiping away tears and there being no more pain. Lots of passages we could think about that would stress and prove the fact that heaven is a calm and tranquil and peaceful place. So you could make both of those. Which one, or specifically, or both? Again, I don't know. So the one that kind of strikes me as the most interesting is what Caleb said also. So, as I mentioned, it's not a decoder ring. You can't go back to the Old Testament and use those symbols. They're not one for one. And the other thing is none of those symbols are directly quoted. However, there are some places in Revelation that correspond very strongly to certain scenes in the Old Testament. Revelation 4 corresponds very closely with Ezekiel 1. In the scene where before the destruction of Jerusalem, Ezekiel's carried away to Babylon, and God appears to him there. A lot of similarities, but there's differences as well. And I think there's a good explanation for this. If you look and think about where we are, remember, we're at God's perspective, we're in heaven looking down. So we appear as a sea before God. But when Ezekiel is on earth and he's looking up at God and the appearance of the cherubim and all of that, he sees God and he's separated by a sky. So what looks from God's perspective as a sea, it looks to us as a sea of stars, a sky, if you will, that separates us and God. And so that makes the most sense of the difference that you see, at least to me, between Ezekiel 1 and Revelation 4. It's the difference of perspective. Revelation 4 is God's perspective looking down. Ezekiel 1 is Ezekiel looking up from earth. Both of them highly symbolic. And there being even other differences besides this that we'll see in just a minute. But that seems to be one of the strongest explanations. But I think, honestly, it could be all of these things. I mean, you can really actually harmonize all of these. It's still the political world, just like Daniel 7 and Revelation 13. It's removed from God. It's not directly affecting Him or ruining His place. And He sees right through it all. Nothing is lost to Him. And again, we would have very different perspectives being here in earth, living among this, thinking about God versus God looking down on it. I think all of these things harmonize and are consistent. The other thing that's interesting, there's two other references to the sea of glass in this book. In chapter 15, the saints are on top of it and it's on fire. And they seem to be leaving. So this could be the idea that they are dying. But they are dying and leaving in joy, singing as they go. And then by the time we get to 21, the sea is gone. So again, if it's the earth, if it's people, if it's governments, if it's kings, all of that society, that's done away. If it's a barrier, if that's only what it's trying to communicate to us, that barrier is removed by the time we get to heaven. So it's hard to say if it's any one or any combination of these. I think there's good reason behind all of them and probably the combination of all of them. Thoughts, comments, questions? I know that's a lot to digest and to think about. Caleb used to have this pretty good sized saltwater tank. We would stand over the top and we would look at the fish and seeing the light kind of bouncing off of it as the fish were swimming. I always wondered, what did it look like if you were a fish looking up? What would you see, watching the lights reflect off the surface? And anyway, I can't help but think of that as the idea of this being like the aquarium wall between us and God as we look up, and that's what Ezekiel sees. All right. So the next thing is these four living creatures. We have the sea of glass, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were four living creatures, full of eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature like a calf. The third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. All right, these 4 living creatures are obviously very special, but there's a few other places where we see descriptions to creatures that are very similar to this. How does this compare to what we see in Isaiah 6, and Ezekiel 1, and Ezekiel 41, and Ezekiel 10 as well? What did you see as far as the similarities?
They were similar in that the same animals and figures were represented,
Mm-hmm.
but in Ezekiel 1, all of them had 4 faces with each of the creatures,
Mm-hmm.
and then here it's just 4 individual creatures.
And they each have a different face, but it's the same 4 faces, but they each only get that one face. All right? So, for sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and put this. So, here in Revelation 4, we've got them in the midst of the throne. They're saying, Holy, holy, holy. Again, as I mentioned to you, it's one of the few places where you see the same word repeated 3 times. We got the 4 living creatures, 6 wings, full of eyes. In Ezekiel 1, he specifically calls them cherubim. They're very, very similar, and I think they're the exact same creature, but they are described slightly differently. And again, this goes back to what I've been telling you. You're not going to see the exact same symbol, just Control-C, Control-V, copy-pasted from Old Testament to New Testament. There's always an adaptation. And I think the message behind that, it's like the miracles that Jesus worked. He never worked the same miracle twice. What's the point? The point is the things that the miracles, the things that the symbols are communicating, what it's communicating, showing you is bigger than the symbols or the miracles that are communicating it. It's not contained by that. It's not entirely adequate to show you how powerful God is. And in a similar kind of way, these symbols are not entirely adequate to fully contain or fully represent everything we see. So we see some variation from these things. So more detail, Ezekiel 1. Here they're under the throne, 4 living creatures. They're kind of like a man, except for they've got these different faces. They have 4 wings instead of 6. They've got like calves' feet, so straightened legs. We have lots of comparisons made to bronze and fire, and then them moving very rapidly and being like torches and like lightning. Again, this is kind of corollary to the idea of them being covered with eyes. But in Ezekiel 10, he calls them, this is the cherubim that he saw earlier, and there he says that they are covered with eyes. And they have the same 4 faces, 4 wings, and we see the same wheels within a wheel that went everywhere without turning that are also in Ezekiel 1 as well. Again, also directed by the Spirit wherever the Spirit said to go. And again, being underneath the throne also as well. So, again, keep in mind Ezekiel's perspective, like under the throne, versus from God's perspective being around and in the throne. These having very close proximity to God and being very closely associated with his throne. So in Psalm 18, 9-11, you have the unique description there that God rides on the clouds. He rides on the cherubim. So they are associated with his actual chariot, if you will. This is the thing that draws it, that transports him. It's that same kind of picture. But the cherubim is also what's on the mercy seat. Remember in the tabernacle with their wings coming forwards? That's what's also described as being cherubim there as well, and God being the one who dwells among the cherubim several times throughout Psalms, as well as throughout the tabernacle and temple references as well. All right, so one last one, may have not thought of in Genesis 3, it was cherubim that was set in front of the Garden of Eden that blocked the way, and they had a fiery sword. In Ezekiel 41, they were carved into that symbolic temple. There they only had 2 faces, but they are again called cherubim. They only had the faces of a man aligned. Again, variation. Isaiah 6 sees a very similar theme, but he sees God and these creatures fill the temple. This is the only reference to seraphim throughout the scriptures. Again, slight variation. 6 wings, and they are above the throne in this place, and they are also associated with coal and with fire and with judgment. Now, quickly, there is one other reference to seraphim. In the wandering in the wilderness, remember when Moses had to set the snake up, the bronze serpent, and there was fiery serpents that were coming through the camp and that was biting them and they were dying from the poison? That's actually the word seraphim. So it's just, all it means is just fire things, fiery ones. They're like, no, it doesn't mean anything more than that. So representative of these beings, yes, that's a very apt description. Representative of poisonous snakes, also, very apt description as well. So I think all of these things are representing this, if you will, the pinnacle of God's creation. We have the top of humanity, we have the top of the angelic beings in the top of the, I would say the top of the world, but this is the top of the universe, right? So this is the pinnacle of all things. This is the height where God is at his highest, and we have the highest of his creation being represented. And beyond both angels and humans, they have this very special seat where they're actually partaking in God's throne. So this brings us to our question for next time. That sounds kind of boring. I mean, they're just sitting there saying, holy, holy, holy. Is it boring? In fact, some people have suggested these aren't even real beings because that would be so monotonous and so boring. So let's talk about that next time. Is that really going to be boring? I'll see you all. Thank you for your participation and your preparation.